Good morning. Welcome to A Tertiary World, a series of readings from a book I wrote in 2008, which was a series of recollections of my life lived in a grid of 7 by 7 streets in inner Melbourne during the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. Today I begin to read you 7 memories, the first 7 memories I could remember of Amess Street. And these memories are not so relevant in themselves. They could be anyone's and are interesting only to the rememberer. But they're offered as a way of us remembering how important it is to recollect one's life as a kind of lens through which we understand our evolution, our unfoldings as our various selves arise and fall. This is the first memory from Amess Street, 295 Amess Street. And the colour is yellow for this street. Cramped, grey with a new yellow linoleum floor. I never understood why we left the wide suburban dreaming spaces of our rented Brighton house to come and live here. The passageway of the North Carlton house extended a very long way right down one side, with 4 rooms opening up from it. This meant that my parents, my sister, my grandmother and I each had a room. This was the first time I had ever had my own room. In Brighton, I'd slept in the living room and had made up my bed each night after everyone went to sleep. Here I had a room with a single bed, a desk, a wardrobe, and a window opening up to a tiny, inaccessible courtyard with weeds growing right up to the windowsill. Weeds that could not have been pulled out, even if one had wanted to, for they could not be reached. The backyard was tiny and all concrete. For a while we kept chickens in a hurriedly made coop, but that didn't work. It seemed to rain a lot during those years and everything was always damp, even in summer. The washing never seemed to dry completely, and the front garden was often covered in puddles, each reflecting a grey sky bordered by sparse weeds. In winter, the walls of my room had tiny droplets trickling down them, glistening by the light of the single globe. Standing under the veranda one dark and stormy day, I made my first painting. My mother was then working as a sales lady in a nearby Carlton chemist, and she brought home a steel display frame to use as part of the chicken house fence. When that idea was abandoned, I decided to adapt it as an easel. I leaned a piece of smooth brown masonite against it and dipped into tiny Dulux tins of bright enamel. I remember my ears and cheeks burning bright red from the excitement. I worked until it got too dark to see, and still I couldn't leave the painting, which I now believed to be something as alive as I felt. One grey November morning later that year, my father came into my room and woke me very early. His voice was unusually urgent and earnest. He told me that a great man had just been assassinated. I'm not sure I knew which was the greatest shock for me, the assassination of an American president by one of his own people, or the fact that my father had deemed this event important enough to wake me and to communicate its news to me with such sincere urgency. But perhaps he had to tell someone, and thinking upon it after all these years, it may not even have been me that he had to tell this thing to, but to himself, repeatedly and out loud. Second story outside 291 Amos Street. Each night during that first summer in Amos Street, I would sit on my front veranda after dinner and watch a group of kids set up a couple of wickets on the street, made up of either metal rubbish bins or wooden fruit cases. The metal bins were preferred because they made such a satisfyingly distinctive sound when the batsman missed the odd straight ball. Finally, one evening, I gathered the courage to join the game, and these were the boys that played: Leon Scholl, Zepp, Neil, Leon Fink, Danny Moga, Kerry, and a few unnamed others. I did okay in those games, particularly this one night when no one seemed to be able to get me out. It had gotten dark, and the unspoken rule was that you couldn't bowl your fastest after dark. After much frustration and after much glaring my way, Zepp did just that and got me out, much to everyone's disdainful protests. But there we were, the next night, ready to go, all previous wounds forgotten. Cars never seemed to drive past to disturb us. We moved a steel bin only once or twice during the entire summer, and that's after the driver had waited patiently, parked in the late evening shade while we completed a particularly important over. We never seemed to tire of playing. We went on for hours until the majority had had enough. The rest of us would leave grumbling, walking away from the warm asphalt regretfully, still carrying with us the unquenched part of a deep thirst. Much later, showered and exhausted, each of us lay in our beds inside the small back rooms of houses all along Amos Street, replaying each shot and each fumble catch in our minds as the vibration of ball thudding into bat still hummed its way up our young arms and trembled there in faintly glowing echoes until we fell asleep. Memory 3, 288 Amos Street. Leon lived across the street from us in number 288, so did his little brother, whose name I've now forgotten, and his younger sister, Shirley. I could just see Shirley's bedroom window from my front veranda, and some evenings I would stand there watching the rain and listening to its drumming on the iron roof. Sometimes Shirley would appear at her bedroom window and we would look at each other for hours, not moving. Or at least I think I was looking at her, because after some time, looking into shadow, eyes divine from it anything the mind desires. Nothing was ever said about this, and I only ever spoke to her once or twice before our lives diverged. During the day, we would politely avoid each other if we could. Yet, after nightfall, the very air seemed to encourage the flowering of a strange new language whose conversations flowed across the street endlessly, silently wordless. Fragments and trifles, but the foundations of the self as the emergent memories when one attempts to recollect what exactly did happen along that street during the mid-1960s. Thank you for your attention. I hope they're useful to you in some way. Obviously not in terms of the memories themselves, but in terms of how you might be tempted to try and recollect some of the fragments that make up yourself. Until tomorrow, I hope you have a peaceful and sunny Saturday.